In this lecture, I'll be focusing on the Jazz Age and the Lost Generation, two overlapping cultural terms describing the 1920s. The discussion draws on Mudita Agarwal's article, The Jazz Age, The Lost Generation, Anton Pokrivčák's American Literature of the 20th Century, Modernism and After, and Arnold Weinstein's Classics of American Literature lectures. These critics will help us define what the Jazz Age meant for American culture, how World War I and postwar disillusionment created the Lost Generation, and why the literature of this period remains central to American identity. The Jazz Age refers to the exuberant decade between 1919 and 1929, remembered for jazz music, flappers, parties, and prosperity, but also for moral decline, alienation, and eventual collapse. The Lost Generation describes the writers who captured this paradox, figures like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and Gertrude Stein. Their work reveals the brilliance and the brokenness of this era. This cover image is Tamara de Olympica's self-portrait, Tamara in the Green Bugatti, a classic Art Deco painting that captures the glamour, modernity, and surface brilliance of the Jazz Age. Throughout the presentation, we'll also use artworks and photographs from Jazz Age nightlife to portraits of Fitzgerald and Hemingway that visually reflect the critics' ideas. Mudita Agarwal describes the Jazz Age through Fitzgerald's famous description, an age of miracles, art, success, and satire. It is often remembered through labels like the Roaring Twenties, the era of excess, and the Gay Twenties. The decade was marked by economic prosperity, industrial growth, and cultural excitement. Jazz music, flappers, automobiles, and new freedoms symbolized a break from the past. Yet Agarwal stresses that beneath that glitter lay moral corruption, spiritual emptiness, and disillusionment. Hedonism and excess concealed deep wounds left by the war. Writers captured this paradox, a society celebrating freedom and pleasure while haunted by insecurity and loss. For Agarwal, the Jazz Age was a glittering surface with a darker underside, a paradise already shading into collapse. The Lost Generation of writers turned this paradox into literature, giving voice to a generation simultaneously intoxicated by pleasure and scarred by trauma. This 1920s photograph of flappers dancing the Charleston captures the exuberance and surface glamour Agarwal describes, while hinting at the deeper disillusionment beneath. Pokrivčák emphasizes the historical context that shaped the Lost Generation. The First World War destroyed faith in progress, stability, and morality. Young intellectuals returned from the war disillusioned, unable to reconcile old ideals with the brutal realities they had seen. In the 1920s, America experienced a boom in industry, consumerism, and mass culture. For many, this was an age of prosperity. For writers, it felt hollow. Puritan values, conformity, and materialism dominated society, but the young writers rejected these traditions. They felt alienated from their own country, often leaving for Paris and other European cities where they found freedom to experiment with new forms and ideas. The Lost Generation was born from this paradox: prosperity and excess on the surface, disillusionment and alienation beneath. Literature became their way of expressing rebellion against conformity and documenting the trauma of their age. This is a photograph of Prohibition-era speakeasy, which highlights the rebellious nature of the 1920s, reflecting the disillusionment and rejection of all traditions that Pokrivčák emphasizes. Agarwal and Pokrivčák both highlight key themes of the Lost Generation's writing. Alienation is central. Writers and characters often feel rootless, displaced, unable to belong. Disillusionment also runs deep. Ideas of progress, morality, and stability no longer seem valid after the war. The American dream itself becomes paradoxical, attractive in its promises of wealth and success, but hollow and empty in its results. Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby is the classic text here: glamour and romance, concealing emptiness and ruin. Agarwal points to Fitzgerald's double vision, his simultaneous attraction to and critique of the Jazz Age. He loved the glitter, but saw its corruption. Hemingway's work reveals a similar tension, a desire for meaning in a world in a world stripped of values. In these ways, the lost generation gave literary form to paradox, simultaneously fascinated by and critical of the age that shaped them. This satirical cartoon of flappers and jazz age excess illustrates the double vision Agrawal highlights: simultaneous attraction to and critique of pleasure and materialism. Weinstein presents F. Scott Fitzgerald as the great chronicle of the jazz age. More than any other writer, he captured the glamour and the emptiness of the 1920s. In The Great Gatsby, the world sparkles with wealth, parties, and romance, but beneath the surface lies corruption and despair. Gatsby himself embodies the paradox of the American dream. He pursues wealth and love with passion, but his dream is always just out of reach, and it ultimately destroys him. Weinstein emphasizes that Fitzgerald's fiction is both a celebration and a critique of the jazz age. He was drawn to the glitter, but always aware of its emptiness. His heroes are men who long for success, but are defeated by a society whose norms they cannot sustain. Fitzgerald thus gave this age both its image and its critique, making him its defining literary voice. This photograph is of Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald at one of those 1920s parties, visually capturing the glamour Weinstein describes, and the very surface brilliance that Fitzgerald critiqued in The Great Gatsby. Weinstein contrasts Hemingway with Fitzgerald as another key figure of the lost generation. If Fitzgerald is the chronicle of glamour and disillusionment, Hemingway is the voice of stoic endurance after collapse. His style is famous, terse, understated, what he called the iceberg theory, where most meaning lies beneath the surface. His characters often face trauma, emptiness, and alienation, yet they seek dignity through courage, ritual, and endurance. In A Farewell to Arms, love offers brief solace but cannot overcome the brutality of war. In his short stories, small acts of courage give characters a fragile sense of meaning. Hemingway's fiction reflects the post-war mood. Values are gone, the world is harsh, but individuals can still carve out moments of grace through endurance. Weinstein suggests that Hemingway's stoicism gave the lost generation its defining ethos, a quiet resilience in the face of emptiness. This portrait of Hemingway in Paris embodies the expatriate ethos Weinstein associates with him: stoic, disillusioned, yet seeking meaning abroad. Pokrivčák and Weinstein both highlight Gertrude Stein's importance. Stein famously coined the phrase "lost generation" to describe the group of disillusioned young writers. Stein was a mentor in Paris, where she hosted salons for artists and writers, including Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Picasso. Paris became the capital of the expatriate imagination, a place where American writers could escape Puritan values and the emptiness of consumer culture. Stein's own writing was experimental, pushing language to new extremes, fragmenting meaning, breaking convention. She embodied the spirit of the avant-garde, blending literature with modern art. The Lost Generation was therefore not only a product of America's post-war disillusionment, but also of its engagement with European modernism. Expatriate life provided freedom, new influences, and new forms. Through Stein and others, the Lost Generation connected American literature to international experimentation, reshaping both. Man Ray's portrait of Gertrude Stein in Paris situates her at the center of the expatriate scene, hosting salons where literature, art, and modernism converged. Our three critics underline the broader significance of the jazz age and the lost generation. This was the first self-conscious literary generation of the 20th century. Writers identified themselves as a group, defined by shared disillusionment and alienation. They critiqued America as materialist, ruthless, and morally bankrupt, while creating enduring works of literature that captured their time. Fitzgerald The Great Gatsby remains a quintessential American novel, as much a warning as a celebration. Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises and other novels defines post-war alienation with unforgettable clarity. Stein's experiments paved the way for new forms of writing. The Jazz Age is remembered as a decade of pleasure and excess, but its writers ensured that it is also remembered for its literature, a literature that mirrored its paradoxes and exposed its corruption while preserving its brilliance. For Agarwal, Pokrivčák, and Weinstein, the lost generation gave the 1920s both its voice and its legacy. This photograph is of Shakespeare and Company, the Paris bookstore where these writers gathered, symbolizing the lost generation's broader significance, an international hub where American literature reinvented itself. To conclude, the Jazz Age was a decade of glamour, prosperity, and cultural revolution, but also of corruption, alienation, and collapse. The Lost Generation describes the writers who gave voice to this paradox: Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Stein, and some others. Fitzgerald chronicled the glamour and despair of the American dream. Hemingway embodied stoic endurance in the face of loss, and Stein defined the group itself while experimenting with language and form. Agarwal emphasizes the double vision of the Jazz Age. Pokrivčák highlights the disillusionment of post-war youth, and Weinstein presents the writers who gave this disillusionment its lasting form. Together, these three critics show that the Jazz Age and the Lost Generation remain central to American literature. They produced classics that both celebrate and critique their age, leaving a legacy of art born from trauma, prosperity, and paradox. Here are photos of Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, John Dos Passos, and Juno Barnes to remind us that the Lost Generation extended beyond Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and Stein, representing a broader circle of writers who captured the paradoxes of the 1920s.